The moment I knew I didn't belong anymore wasn't loud. It was a dry erase board hanging in the kitchen of our family restaurant. Every name was there, except mine. No explanation, no argument, just people looking away like it was normal. Dozens of employees, my own family. Not one person asked a question. My name didn't just disappear from the schedule. That's when I realized it had been erased from the story a long time ago. If this resonates with you, like the video, share it, and subscribe for what comes next. I didn't start out as the problem child. I didn't start out as the difficult one. I grew up inside that restaurant. Before I was tall enough to see over the prep counter, I was already wiping tables. Before I could legally work, I was folding menus, restocking napkins, learning which suppliers showed up late and which ones didn't. No one asked me to. It was just understood. People like to call it independence. They said it like it was a compliment. Elena's fine. She can handle it. She's always been mature for her age. She doesn't need much. At first, I believed them when other kids were told to go play. I stayed back to help close when others were taught how things worked. I learned by watching from the corner. I didn't complain. I didn't push. I didn't ask why. I thought being useful was the same as being valued. As the years went on, that label followed me everywhere. Independent, self-sufficient, low maintenance. It meant I didn't need to be included in conversations. It meant decisions could be made without me. It meant my absence wouldn't cause friction. I noticed it in small ways first. Meetings that happened when I was scheduled to work the floor. Emails I wasn't copied on because it didn't concern me. Changes implemented after the fact. Explained quickly, like footnotes. No one said I wasn't allowed. They just acted like it didn't matter whether I was there. Whenever I hesitated, the same phrase came back around. She'll be fine. She can take care of herself. That sentence sounds harmless until you hear it enough times. Then you realize what it's really doing. It turns your resilience into an excuse, your adaptability into a reason to step back, your silence into consent. There's a kind of parenting, and I use that word loosely, where no one yells at you, no one hits you, no one even openly rejects you. They just stop standing next to you. Psychologists call it disengaged parenting. I didn't know the term back then. I just knew what it felt like. You don't get comfort when things go wrong. You don't get back up when someone crosses a line. You're expected to absorb impact quietly because you always have. And the strangest part is how proud people seem of it. They talk about you like a success story. She's strong. She doesn't need help. What they don't say is that strength, learned too early, usually comes from necessity, not choice. I wasn't independent because I wanted to be. I was independent because there was no one reliably behind me. Over time, I learned to anticipate instead of ask, to document instead of complain, to stay alert instead of emotional. Not because I was planning anything, just because that's what survival looked like. Every time something felt unfair, I told myself it wasn't personal. Every time a decision cut me out, I assumed there was a reason. Every time I felt that quiet sting, I swallowed it. I told myself this was adulthood. But there's a difference between growing up and being left behind. The problem with being labeled the one who can handle it is that eventually, people stop checking whether you should have to. They stop noticing when the workload shifts, when the credit disappears, when your role shrinks. They don't see it as taking from you. They see it as efficiency, and you don't see it as abandonment. You see it as something you're supposed to endure. Looking back, the warning signs were obvious. My opinions were asked for less often. My access narrowed quietly. My responsibilities stayed the same, but my authority didn't. I was still expected to show up early, still expected to clean up problems, still expected to stay calm when things got tense. I just wasn't expected to matter. If you'd asked anyone then, they would have said there was no issue, no conflict, no mistreatment, just one person carrying more weight than the others, just one person being capable. I didn't realize how dangerous that word had become until much later. Because when the moment came, the one where my name disappeared from the schedule, it didn't feel sudden. It felt inevitable, like the natural conclusion of years spent being convenient. I remember standing there, staring at the board, trying to trace the logic backward, trying to figure out where I'd crossed the line. And that's when it finally clicked. I hadn't crossed a line. I had been standing just outside it the whole time. The truth is, independence is only empowering when it's chosen. When it's forced, it's just abandonment with better branding. And when people get used to you handling everything on your own, they eventually forget why you were doing it in the first place. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me alert, because once you understand that your strength has been used as permission to step away, you stop proving you can survive without support, and you start paying attention to who benefits from that belief. That's when I stopped asking why they didn't include me and started asking what they assumed I'd never question. It took me a few days to understand that what happened to me wasn't just a family issue. At first, I kept it contained in my head. Victor, Madison, my mother, the usual names. But then I started noticing how everyone else reacted, or more accurately, how they didn't. The restaurant was the center of the town, not metaphorically, literally. If you lived there, you either worked for us, supplied us, or depended on someone who did. Birthdays were paid for by paychecks from that kitchen. Mortgages were covered by busy summers and decent tips. Everyone knew who ran the place. Everyone knew who signed the checks. And everyone knew when something was off. The morning after my name disappeared from the schedule, nothing stopped moving. The grills were hot. Orders kept coming in. The radio played the same local news segment it always did. People looked at me differently, though not openly, just carefully. A server I'd worked with for years asked if I wanted coffee, then hesitated. Someone in the prep area started to say my name and stopped halfway. One of the suppliers avoided my eyes entirely while unloading crates. No one asked what happened, not because they didn't notice, because they did. In a small town, information moves faster than truth. By noon, everyone knew I'd been taken off rotation. By dinner, there were already versions of why. I heard them secondhand. She must have done something. They're restructuring, family stuff, best not to get involved. That last one came up a lot. Best not to get involved. I started to realize how that phrase functioned. It wasn't caution, it was currency. Staying silent bought you safety, a paycheck, predictability. People weren't choosing sides. They were choosing survival. I'd spent years thinking the imbalance was personal, that I was missing something, that if I worked harder, stayed calmer, proved myself longer, things would shift. But watching the town respond showed me something else. This wasn't about me being difficult. It was about me being inconvenient. Power didn't like disruption. And silence was how it protected itself. I saw it in the smallest interactions. A line cook slipped me a note with a phone number on it, then immediately apologized for causing trouble. A manager told me, quietly, that they thought it was unfair, then reminded me they had kids. No one said they disagreed out loud. They just said it in ways that carried no consequences. The town had learned a long time ago that fairness was optional. Stability wasn't. If you challenged the people at the top, you didn't get applause. You got isolated. And isolation worked better than threats. I thought back to other moments I'd ignored over the years, when someone got passed over for a promotion without explanation, when hours were cut after a disagreement, when people disappeared from schedules and no one asked why. Each time, there was a story that made it seem reasonable, temporary, necessary. But stacked together, they formed a pattern, one that didn't require cruelty to function, just compliance. I started paying attention to what people said when they thought no one was listening. It's not worth it. That's just how it is. You can't fight them. Those sentences were repeated so often they stopped sounding like opinions. They sounded like rules. I'd grown up believing this was a family business. What I was seeing was something else entirely. It was an ecosystem. One where silence kept things running, where discomfort was absorbed quietly, where the cost of speaking up was always higher than the cost of staying quiet. And the thing about ecosystems like that is they don't need villains. They just need enough people who don't want to lose what little they have. I didn't blame them. Not really. Fear makes sense when rent is due, when your health insurance is tied to a job, when there aren't many alternatives. But understanding their fear didn't make my position safer. It made it lonelier. I stopped expecting support. I stopped looking for allies. Instead, I watched. I noticed who changed their behavior when Victor walked into a room, who laughed a little too quickly, who nodded without listening. I noticed how decisions flowed downward and responsibility flowed sideways. And I realized something uncomfortable. The system didn't punish people for being wrong. It punished them for being visible. As long as unfairness stayed quiet, it stayed acceptable. That was the real boundary. Not right and wrong, not family and outsiders. Visibility. The moment my situation became obvious, the town did what it always did. It looked away. If you're listening to this and you've lived in a place like that, you already know the feeling. That pressure to keep your head down, to not be the one who makes things awkward. You tell yourself it's temporary, that it's not your fight, that someone else will say something, but no one ever does. Standing there, watching how smoothly everything adjusted without me, I finally understood the scale of what I was up against. This wasn't about getting my name back on a board. It was about confronting a system that depended on people believing silence was neutral. I didn't know yet what I was going to do. I just knew one thing. If I stayed quiet, the story would already be written, and I'd already seen how that version ended. So I stopped asking who was on my side and started asking what the silence was protecting. After that schedule board moment, I didn't storm out. I didn't throw anything. I just stood there longer than I should have, staring at the space where my name used to be. The kitchen sounded normal. Knives on cutting boards, fryers popping. Someone laughing too loud at a joke that wasn't funny. And then I realized something. The erasure wasn't the sharpest part. It was what happened right after. Nothing. No one said, "Hey, where's Elena's name?" No one said, "That can't be right." No one even said, "Are you okay?" People just adjusted. A server picked up the marker like it was a pen at a bank. A dishwasher turned his back and pretended the sink needed his full attention. Two of the newer hires glanced at me, then looked away fast, like eye contact was dangerous. My mom was there. She was holding a tray of glasses, like she'd been assigned a role in a play. She stared at the floor. Then she walked past me. Not because she didn't see me, because she did. That was the moment my stomach dropped. If you've ever had that feeling, you know it doesn't come from fear, it comes from clarity. You stop wondering if you're imagining things. You stop asking if you're being sensitive. Because when a room full of people goes silent at the same time, it's not an accident, it's a decision. And the silence wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was practical. It sounded like, "Don't make this harder." It looked like busy hands and lowered eyes. It felt like a door closing without a slam. I used to think the worst thing someone could do to you was hurt you, but there's something worse than being hurt. It's being hurt and then watching everyone agree not to acknowledge it. I started noticing the patterns in real time. The manager cleared his throat, started to say something, then caught Victor's eye and stopped. One of the cooks shifted his weight like he wanted to step forward, then remembered his rent. A bartender gave me a look that said, "I'm sorry," and then turned to polish a glass that was already clean. No one shoved me. No one insulted me out loud. But also no one protected me. And that space between those two things, that space is where damage lives. We tell ourselves silence is neutral. We tell ourselves it's not our business. But in places like that, families, small towns, workplaces, silence isn't empty. It has weight. And when you place that weight on the wrong side, it becomes part of the harm. People love to say, "I didn't do anything." Like that's a defense. But "I didn't do anything" is exactly what keeps powerful people comfortable. It's the soft blanket they pull up when someone starts to shake the room. I could see the thought behind their faces. If I speak up, I get dragged into it. If I ask questions, I get noticed. If I defend her, I become the next person on the chopping block. So they picked the safest option. They picked nothing. And I don't say that like I'm confused about it. I understood their math. This place fed their families. This place paid their bills. This place gave them stability. Victor Hale signed their checks. Victor Hale controlled their hours. Victor Hale decided who stayed and who disappeared. It's hard to be brave when bravery comes with consequences. And there it was again. That word. Consequences. Victor didn't need to threaten anyone. He didn't need to raise his voice. All he had to do was stand there like he owned the air, and everyone remembered what silence had already bought them. I looked around the kitchen and it hit me. I wasn't just dealing with one person. I was dealing with a system where everyone had learned the same lesson. Don't challenge the people in charge. Don't ask for fairness. Don't make waves. And systems like that don't fall apart because someone cries. They don't fall apart because someone gets angry. They fall apart when someone makes the truth impossible to ignore. I didn't have that yet. Not in that moment. In that moment, all I had was the board, the blank space, and the silence. I remember my hands shaking slightly, not from rage, but from that strange humiliation that doesn't have words, like my body was reacting to something my mind couldn't fully accept. And I kept thinking over and over, how many times have I watched this happen to someone else? How many times have I stayed quiet because it wasn't me? That question didn't make me feel better. It made me honest. Because here's what no one likes to admit. Sometimes the people in the room aren't cruel. They're just trained. Trained to look away. Trained to keep their heads down. Trained to treat another person's pain like an inconvenience. And once you see that training, you can't unsee it. I walked out to the back alley behind the kitchen because I needed air. The ocean was a few blocks away, but you could still smell it. Salt and diesel and old fish boxes. I leaned against the wall and listened to the muffled noise inside. The restaurant kept moving without me, and that's what finally broke something open in my chest. It wasn't the marker. It wasn't the missing name. It was the realization that a room full of people can watch you get erased and still go back to chopping onions. If you were me, what would you do with that? Would you beg to be let back in? Would you try to be nicer, quieter, more convenient? Or would you start asking a different question? Not, why don't they like me? But what are they protecting? Because silence is never free. Someone always pays for it. And that day, it was me. I didn't go back inside right away. I walked 2 blocks toward the water until the noise of the kitchen faded. My phone buzzed twice. I didn't check it. I sat on the edge of a low concrete wall near the docks and tried to breathe like nothing had happened. But my body didn't believe that. My hands still smelled like lemon sanitizer and fryer oil. My throat felt tight, like I'd swallowed something sharp. And all I could see was that blank space on the board, the place where my name used to be. When I finally went home, it was late. Not the kind of late where you're tired from work. The kind of late where you're tired from being erased in front of people who know your middle name. My apartment was quiet. The fridge hummed. The streetlight outside made the walls look washed out. I kicked off my shoes and stood there for a minute, just staring at nothing. Then I did something I hadn't done in a long time. I opened the hall closet. On the top shelf, behind a stack of old aprons and a broken space heater I kept meaning to throw away, there was a plastic storage bin. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't locked. It didn't have a label, but I knew what it was. My dad called it his storm box. When I was a kid, I used to think that meant flashlights and canned food, batteries, first aid kits. It wasn't that. It was paperwork. He used to say, salt air ruins everything if you don't protect it. And he wasn't just talking about boats. The bin was heavy. The lid stuck a little when I pulled it off, like it hadn't been opened in years. Inside were folders sealed in clear sleeves, receipts stacked in neat bundles, a small notebook with my dad's handwriting on the cover, and right on top an envelope. My name was written on it in block letters, not my nickname, not Kiddo, just Elena Brooks. My hands started shaking again, not from fear this time, from something that felt like being seen by someone who wasn't even alive anymore. I sat on the floor and opened it. The first page was a short letter. It wasn't emotional. That wasn't my dad's style. It was simple. If you're reading this, something happened. If you're reading this, you need facts, not arguments. If you're reading this, don't talk first. Don't accuse. Document. Then, underneath it, a list. Dates, times, names, not dramatic names, either. Supplier companies, account numbers cut off halfway, shipment codes. The kind of boring details most people ignore, the kind of details that become very interesting when someone's lying. I flipped through the folders. There were copies of contracts I'd never seen, a trust agreement with my dad's signature and a notarized stamp, A timeline of ownership transfers written in the same steady handwriting he used to write grocery lists. My brain kept trying to find the twist, the catch, the part where it said, "Just kidding." But the pages didn't change. They stayed consistent. And the more I read, the more something settled into place that I didn't want to admit. My dad hadn't trusted the situation the way I did. He hadn't believed that being family would protect me. He hadn't assumed that love would override greed. He had planned for the possibility that it wouldn't. There was a section in the trust document that made my stomach turn. A clause that basically said if certain actions were taken, if access was restricted, if records were altered, if specific funds moved in specific ways, then the trust could be triggered. Not emotionally triggered, legally triggered, consequences triggered. My dad didn't write like someone who expected fairness. He wrote like someone who expected someone to try something, and he built a system that didn't rely on anyone's conscience. It relied on paper. I remember staring at one page for a long time. It was a chart, a simple flow of money between accounts tied to the business. There were dates circled in red. Under each circle, my dad had written one word: evidence. I kept hearing his voice in my head, like he was standing behind me with his arms crossed. People will argue with your feelings. They won't argue with numbers. I used to think he was cynical. Sitting there on my living room floor, I realized he was practical. And for the first time since my name got erased, I felt something different than humiliation. I felt orientation, like someone had handed me a map in a dark place. I wasn't imagining things. I wasn't too sensitive. I wasn't making drama. There was a structure underneath the silence, and my dad had left a record of it. I kept reading until my eyes burned. There were notes about suppliers being paid twice, invoices that didn't match deliveries, signatures that looked like mine but weren't. And then, in the notebook, a line that stopped me cold. Check the scheduling logs. Control begins there. I sat back against the couch and exhaled like I'd been holding my breath for years. That schedule board wasn't just petty, it was strategic. Because if you control who works, you control who sees. If you control who sees, you control what gets questioned. And if nothing gets questioned, nothing changes. My dad had understood that. He had watched it happen before it happened to me. I stared down at the folders spread out across my living room floor, and something finally shifted. Up until then, I'd been trying to survive their version of the story. Now I had mine. Not a story made of emotions. A story made of documents. A story made of timestamps. A story made of proof. If you were me, what would you do with that? Would you confront them right away and watch them deny it? Would you hand it over to someone who didn't understand the context? Would you panic and blow your chance to do it clean? I didn't do any of that. I picked up my dad's notebook. I opened to the first page, and I started my own timeline. Because once you have evidence, you're not just hurt anymore, you're dangerous. And the people who erased your name, they usually don't realize it until it's too late. After I built that timeline, I didn't feel victorious. I felt tired. Not the kind of tired you fix with sleep. The kind you get when you realize you've been carrying something that was never yours to carry. I left the folders on my living room floor for 2 days. I stepped around them like they were broken glass. Every time I looked at them, I thought about the board, the blank space, my mom walking past me with a tray. And I kept circling back to one question. When did I start believing I had to earn my place? When did I start believing I had to earn my place? When did I start believing I had to earn my place? When did I start believing I had to earn my place? When did I start believing I had to earn my place? When did I start believing I had to earn my place? When did I start believing I had to earn my place? When did I start believing I had to earn my place? When did I start believing I had to earn my place? When did I start believing I had to earn my place? When did I start believing I had to earn my place? When did I start believing I had to earn my place? When did I start believing I had to earn my place? When did I start believing I had to earn my place? When did I start believing I had to earn my place? When did I start believing I had to earn my place? When did I start believing I had to earn my place? When did I start believing I had to earn my place? When did I start believing I had to earn my place? Because if you grow up in a normal family, you don't think that way. You don't measure your worth in shifts covered and problems solved. You don't rehearse your words before speaking, like love has conditions. You just belong. Or at least, you're supposed to. Somewhere along the way, in our family, belonging became a performance. If I was helpful, I was part of it. If I stayed quiet, I was mature. If I didn't cause friction, I was easy to love. And I didn't notice the trap because the words sounded positive, strong, independent, low maintenance. Those words can be a compliment. But in my house, they were a deal. They meant don't ask, don't need, don't take up space. The worst part is how normal it starts to feel. You learn to swallow your feelings before dinner. You learn to apologize first just to keep the peace. You learn to laugh at comments that sting because correcting them would make you dramatic, and everyone around you calls it maturity. If you've lived like that, you know the specific kind of loneliness it creates. You're surrounded by people. You might even be loved in a limited way, but you're still alone because you can't relax. You can't just exist. You're always performing acceptable. And for a long time, I thought that was what family was, until I didn't have the energy to pretend anymore. I remember sitting at my kitchen table, staring at my dad's notebook. The apartment was quiet, except for the occasional car outside and the ticking of the cheap clock above my sink. I thought about my dad and how he used to come home smelling like sea air and bleach, tired but present. He wasn't perfect, but when he was there, I didn't feel like I had to audition. I didn't have to prove I deserved a seat at the table. That's the thing people don't talk about. A real family isn't supposed to make you smaller so you can stay. It isn't supposed to reward your silence. It isn't supposed to treat your needs like an inconvenience. If the only way you can stay is by disappearing, that isn't belonging. That's compliance. And compliance has a cost. It costs you your voice. It costs you your confidence. It costs you years. Sometimes it costs you your sense of self so slowly you don't notice it leaving. I thought about the times I'd held my tongue because I didn't want to ruin things. Holiday dinners, staff parties, meetings where I watched decisions get made and told myself it wasn't the right moment. I told myself I was being respectful, but respect doesn't require self-erasure. Peace that depends on one person swallowing everything isn't peace, it's control. And once I admitted that, something shifted. I stopped asking, what do I need to do to be included? And I started asking, why do I have to earn what other people get for free? Why do they get grace? And I get conditions. Why do they get mistakes? And I get consequences. Why do they get to take up space, and I have to shrink to survive? Those questions didn't make me emotional. They made me clear, because clarity does something important. It pulls you out of the role you've been assigned, the role of the one who keeps things smooth, the one who doesn't ask for too much, the one who can handle it. I realized I'd been trying to win love from people who used love like leverage. And I don't say that to make anyone look like a villain. I say it because it's the truth. Some people don't love you for who you are. They love you for what you allow. And the moment you stop allowing, they call you selfish. They call you ungrateful. They say you've changed. If you were me, what would you do with that realization? Would you keep proving yourself? Would you keep negotiating your dignity for a seat you already earned? Would you keep calling it family because it's easier than calling it what it is? I didn't have all the answers, but I knew one thing. If a place only lets you stay when you're quiet, that place isn't safe. And if it isn't safe, it isn't family no matter what last name you share. That didn't heal anything overnight. It didn't make my mom suddenly brave. It didn't make Victor suddenly fair, but it changed how I moved. Because once you understand you shouldn't have to prove your worth to belong, you stop begging, you stop negotiating, you stop shrinking, and you start doing something people like that fear more than anger. You start standing where you are, like you have a right to exist. And that was the moment I stopped trying to be accepted and started preparing to be believed. I used to think if I just explained things better, everything would change, if I found the right words, if I stayed calm, if I made them feel what I felt. That's what we're taught, right? That honesty and emotion are enough. But in families like mine, emotion doesn't create justice. It creates discomfort. And discomfort is easy to ignore when you hold the power. I replayed conversations in my head for years. Moments where I should have spoken louder. Moments where I should have cried less. Moments where I thought, this time they'll understand. They never did. Because emotion doesn't threaten a system that benefits from you staying quiet. It actually helps it. When you get emotional, the focus shifts from what happened to how you reacted. Suddenly the story isn't about being erased from the schedule. It's about you being too sensitive. It's not about control. It's about your tone, and once that happens, nothing changes. I started to notice a pattern. Every time someone raised a concern, it was treated like a mood problem. Every time someone asked a question, it became a loyalty issue. Feelings were allowed, but only in private, only if they didn't require consequences. That's when it clicked. Emotion is human, but systems don't respond to humanity. They respond to structure. Power doesn't move because you're hurt. It moves when it's forced to. That's a hard thing to accept when you've been taught that being emotional is being honest. But honesty without leverage is just vulnerability. And vulnerability, in the wrong hands, becomes a weakness. When I finally opened my dad's files, I didn't feel angry. I felt focused. There were dates, signatures, numbers that didn't line up, no raised voices, no dramatic confrontations, just evidence. And something interesting happened when I stopped leading with how I felt. People listened, not because they suddenly cared about my pain, but because now there were consequences attached. That's the part no one tells you. In dysfunctional families, emotions are often weaponized against the person who feels them. Your sadness becomes instability. Your anger becomes disrespect. Your boundaries become betrayal. But evidence is quiet. It doesn't argue. It doesn't explain itself. It just exists. And existence is harder to dismiss than tears. I think that's why so many people stay stuck. We're told to talk it out, to be honest, to say how you feel, and when it doesn't work, we assume we failed. We didn't say it right. We didn't wait long enough. We didn't try hard enough. But what if the problem isn't communication? What if the problem is that there's nothing in it for them to change? If you were me, ask yourself this. What incentive does power have to give itself up? Why would someone who benefits from the current setup suddenly decide to be fair? They don't. Not because they're evil, but because systems don't run on guilt. They run on risk. That's why I stopped asking for understanding. I started documenting. I stopped hoping for accountability. I started building it. Receipts, emails, agreements, things that don't care if you're calm enough or polite enough. Things that stand even when you're not in the room. And I know that sounds cold, but cold doesn't mean cruel. It means precise. There's a difference between being heartless and being disciplined. I wasn't trying to punish anyone. I was trying to protect myself. And protection requires more than feelings. It requires proof. Once I had that, the dynamic shifted. Conversations changed. The silence felt heavier. The confidence people had in dismissing me faded. Not because I became louder, but because I became undeniable. That's when I realized this wasn't just about my family. This is how power works everywhere. In workplaces, in institutions, in small towns. Emotion gets sympathy. Evidence gets results. That doesn't mean your feelings don't matter. They matter deeply. They're the signal that something is wrong, but they're not the solution. They're the reason you start looking for one. I still felt hurt. I still felt alone. But now those feelings had direction. They weren't spilling out anymore. They were being converted into action. And that's when things stopped feeling hopeless. Because justice doesn't require everyone to suddenly grow a conscience. It requires a structure that makes ignoring you expensive. That's an uncomfortable truth. But it's also a freeing one. You don't have to convince people who are committed to misunderstanding you. You don't have to perform your pain for it to be valid. You just have to decide whether you want to be heard or protected. I chose protection, and once I did, everything that came next stopped being about emotion and started being about consequences. People kept asking me why I didn't confront him right away, why I didn't make a scene, why I didn't say exactly what I felt in that moment, as if justice was supposed to look like a raised voice and a slammed door. I understood the impulse. I felt it too. Anger is loud. It wants movement. It wants release. But anger is impatient, and impatience is expensive. I learned early on that reacting feels powerful, but it rarely is. When you react, you give them timing, you give them context, you give them control. They get to decide what matters and what doesn't. I watched it happen over and over. Someone would finally snap. Words would spill out. And suddenly the focus wasn't on what was done to them. It was on how they behaved. That's how revenge works. It feels good for a moment. Then it disappears. Justice doesn't disappear. Justice stays. The difference took me years to understand. Revenge is emotional. Justice is methodical. Revenge wants them to feel what you felt. Justice wants the behavior to stop. Revenge explodes. Justice accumulates. I didn't win by being louder than Victor. I won by being quieter than he expected. While everyone assumed I was over it, I was documenting. While they thought my silence meant submission, it meant discipline. Every time I wanted to react, I wrote something down instead, dates, names, small inconsistencies no one thought mattered. I kept a notebook in my bag. Nothing dramatic, just facts. I didn't trust my memory when I was emotional. I trusted paper. Anger clouds details. Discipline preserves them. There were nights I wanted to confront him so badly my hands shook. I imagined the look on his face, the words I would finally say. But I knew how that story ended. With me being too much, with him being misunderstood, so I waited. Waiting doesn't mean weakness. Waiting means you're choosing a better outcome. Justice isn't about timing your emotions, it's about timing your move. And timing requires patience most people don't have. That's why so many powerful people underestimate quiet ones. They mistake restraint for fear. They don't realize restraint is a skill. A disciplined person can sit with discomfort longer than an undisciplined one. That's an advantage. I wasn't trying to hurt anyone. I was trying to make the truth unavoidable. And truth doesn't need volume. It needs structure. When the documents came out, no one asked how angry I was. They asked how long it had been going on. That's the shift. Anger asks for sympathy. Discipline creates consequences. One is optional, the other isn't. I think a lot of people confuse justice with revenge because revenge looks satisfying from the outside. It's cinematic, it's emotional, but it burns fast and leaves nothing behind. Justice is slower, it's quieter, and it lasts. Justice changes the rules so the same harm can't happen again. Revenge just changes who's hurting. I didn't want him embarrassed. I wanted him limited. I wanted systems to respond. I wanted protections in place for people who didn't have the luxury of reacting emotionally. That required patience. That required restraint. That required me to swallow my pride more times than I can count. Discipline isn't glamorous. It's lonely. It's boring. It's doing the same careful thing every day while everyone else assumes you've moved on. It's being underestimated on purpose. If you were me, would you have waited? Would you have trusted the long game when every instinct told you to explode? That's the part no one sees. Justice isn't a moment, it's a process. And processes favor people who can control themselves longer than others can control the situation. I didn't choose discipline because I was calm. I chose it because I was angry enough to want something permanent. Anger made me want to react. Discipline made me want to finish. And when the consequences finally arrived, they didn't come with shouting. They came with paperwork, with meetings, with doors quietly closing. That's when I knew I'd made the right choice, because nothing about it felt explosive. It felt final. Justice isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It shows up, changes the balance, and leaves. And the people who depended on chaos to stay powerful, they never see it coming. Not because they aren't smart, but because they mistake discipline for weakness. And that mistake costs them everything. The thing about evidence is it doesn't stay contained. You think it's going to be a private confrontation, a closed-door conversation, a quiet correction, and then it spreads, not like gossip, like gravity. Once I had the documents organized, I stopped guessing and started verifying. I pulled old scheduling logs. I cross-checked supplier invoices with delivery dates. I compared payroll reports to bank transfers. At first, it just looked messy. The kind of messy people excuse because the business is busy, because it's a family operation, because things slip through the cracks. But the more I checked, the less it looked like cracks. It looked like design, payments going out twice, vendor names slightly altered by one letter, refunds processed without corresponding returns. And there was one pattern that kept repeating. Anything that made someone else powerful was clear and documented. Anything that protected workers was vague, delayed, or missing. That's not an accident. I didn't go to Victor first. That would have been emotional. That would have been generous. I went to the trust agreement. I read it line by line, the way my dad wanted me to. Then I found the clause he'd underlined in pen. Not bold, not highlighted, just a single line with a quiet instruction next to it. Trigger conditions. My stomach turned over when I realized what it meant. The trust wasn't just about me. It wasn't just a safety net for the family name. It was built to protect the people who kept the place running. There was a section titled Employee Benefit Trust. I had never heard those words spoken out loud in my family. I read it twice to make sure I wasn't misunderstanding. A portion of profits, held in trust, intended for long-term employees. Certain events could activate distributions. Certain types of misconduct could shift authority. It wasn't sentimental. It was structural. My dad didn't leave behind a blessing. He left behind leverage. And the second I understood that, the entire town entered the story. Because this wasn't just about my name being erased. This was about money that belonged to people who'd been silent for years. People who had kids, people with bad backs and worn-out hands, people who stayed loyal because loyalty felt safer than change. I didn't announce it. I didn't hint. I did the one thing Victor couldn't control. I verified, and then I did the second thing he couldn't control. I filed, not with emotion, with documents. That part was quiet. The paperwork didn't come with a dramatic soundtrack. It came with a stamp, a confirmation email, a case number that looked like nothing. But cases like that don't stay invisible, not in a small town. People started feeling it before they understood it. Victor began showing up early and leaving late. Managers started checking their phones more often. People stopped joking around when he walked in. Then, one morning, the town's favorite form of truth arrived. A meeting notice. It wasn't posted on the schedule board. It was sent to work emails and printed by the office printer that everyone used. A formal review, financial oversight, an external party involved. Those words have a way of cutting through silence. I watched the staff read it like it was a weather alert. Some people looked scared. Some looked relieved. Most looked confused. Because when you've lived under a system for a long time, you stop imagining it can change. You stop believing consequences are real until they are. The first person who approached me wasn't brave. It was a dishwasher named Luis who had worked there longer than I'd been alive. He didn't ask what was happening. He asked one question in a voice barely above a whisper. Are they gonna mess with our checks? That's when I realized what silence had been buying them. Not comfort, security, even if it was a fragile kind. I told him the truth, but I kept it simple. I'm not here to take anything from you. I didn't promise more than I could prove. I didn't make speeches. I just said what was verifiable. There are protections in place. My dad set them up, and they're not optional. He stared at me for a long time, like he didn't know how to hold that information. Then he nodded once and walked away. After that, it wasn't just Luis. A server who never made eye contact started leaving copies of old receipts on my locker. A line cook quietly handed me a USB drive and said, "This is from the office computer. No explanations, no hero moments, just evidence." That's how a town changes. Not because everyone suddenly becomes brave, because they realize silence is no longer the safest option. When the oversight meeting finally happened, it wasn't held in a courtroom. It was held in the back room of the restaurant, the one we used for holiday parties and staff birthdays, fold-out chairs, bad coffee, a stale plate of cookies no one touched. Victor walked in like he owned it, until he saw who was sitting at the table. Not me, not my mother. A neutral professional in a plain suit, with a laptop and a folder of printed documents. The kind of person who doesn't care about family dynamics. The kind of person who cares about numbers. Victor started speaking like he always did, confident, casual, dismissive. And then the first document slid across the table. He stopped. Not dramatically, just a small pause, like his brain needed time to catch up to the fact that this wasn't a conversation he could control. The staff sat quietly, watching, and for the first time, their silence wasn't complicity, it was attention, because now the silence wasn't protecting him, it was witnessing him. That's the twist people don't expect. The town that stayed quiet for years didn't suddenly become righteous. They became involved, not emotionally, legally, structurally, because the moment the trust language entered the room, everyone in that building became more than employees. They became stakeholders. And stakeholders don't look away the same way. If you were me, would you have believed that was possible? That the same town that avoided your eyes could eventually be forced to look? That the same silence that hurt you could turn into the thing that holds someone accountable? I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady. Because what was happening wasn't revenge. It was redistribution of power. And power doesn't shift with yelling. It shifts when the rules change. That day, the rules changed, and the town had no choice but to watch. If you're still here, I want to talk to you directly for a moment, not as part of the story, not as an observer, as someone who might be living something similar right now, because I know what it feels like to stay quiet just to get through the day, to tell yourself it's temporary, that it's not worth the fight, that you'll deal with it later. Silence can feel like survival. It keeps the job. It keeps the peace. It keeps things from getting worse. At least, that's what it promises. And sometimes, it even delivers for a while. I stayed silent for years because it worked on the surface. I wasn't yelled at. I wasn't singled out. I wasn't pushed any further. I told myself that meant I was being smart. But silence doesn't come free. It charges interest. It shows up in the way you hesitate before speaking, in the way you over-explain, in the way you start doubting things you used to know were wrong. You don't notice it all at once. You notice it when you're alone, when you replay conversations in your head, when you wonder why you're always tired, when you realize you've been managing other people's comfort at the expense of your own safety. I'm not here to tell you to confront anyone. I'm not here to tell you to blow things up. That kind of advice is easy to give and expensive to follow. What I am here to say is this: silence might protect you today, but it doesn't protect you tomorrow. It doesn't protect your future. It doesn't protect your boundaries. And it definitely doesn't protect the truth. What does protect you is clarity. And clarity starts quietly. It starts with noticing patterns instead of dismissing them. It starts with writing things down instead of letting them slide. It starts with saving the email, keeping the message, taking the note when something doesn't sit right, not to use it, not to threaten anyone, just to have it. Because evidence isn't aggression, it's preparation. I didn't wake up one day ready to change everything. I woke up tired of pretending nothing was happening, and once I stopped pretending, I didn't rush. I observed. I documented. I let things reveal themselves instead of forcing them. That's something silence never taught me. Silence taught me how to endure. Evidence taught me how to protect myself. There's a difference. If you're in a place where speaking up would cost you too much right now, that doesn't make you weak. It makes you realistic. But being realistic doesn't mean being careless with your future. It means playing the long game. It means understanding that your feelings are valid, but they don't have to be your only tool. You're allowed to wait. You're allowed to prepare. You're allowed to choose timing over impulse. That doesn't make you dishonest. It makes you strategic. I wish someone had told me earlier that staying quiet doesn't mean doing nothing. You can be quiet and still be building something. You can be quiet and still be paying attention. You can be quiet and still be preparing for a moment when silence is no longer your only option. If you were me, ask yourself this: is your silence keeping you safe or keeping you stuck? And if it's keeping you stuck, what's one small thing you could do differently, not publicly, not dramatically, privately? A note, a folder, a saved message, something that says, I see what's happening, even if no one else does. Because the truth doesn't disappear just because no one acknowledges it. It waits. And when it's supported by evidence, it doesn't need permission to matter. I didn't get justice because I was brave. I got it because I was patient. Because I stopped relying on people's empathy and started relying on facts. Because I understood that systems don't change out of kindness. They change when ignoring you becomes risky. If this story connected with you in any way, you're not alone, and you're not imagining things. If you want to share your experience, you can do that in the comments. Sometimes saying it out loud once is enough to remind yourself you're not invisible. And if this helped you see something more clearly, consider liking the video or subscribing. Not for me, but because stories like this only reach the people who need them when they're shared. Silence may help you survive today, but clarity and proof are what protect you tomorrow. And you deserve a tomorrow where you don't have to disappear just to exist.